And so without delay, Sam, I'm going to hand this over to you now. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, thanks, Jodie. Yeah, hi, everybody. Sam Sullivan. I think I know a good chunk of you on the call, but for those of you I haven't met before, hello. And yeah, welcome. So today, just a little quick bit about who we are, one slide, and then straight into the National Resident Survey side of things. So Date Cymru, who we are, we're part of local government in Wales. We are basically part of, we do everything data related. So we're funded and wholly owned by the Welsh Local Government Association. We share an office with them where I am today, and we provide a range of specialist data, statistical and research services, as it says on the slide. So that's all sorts of things from collecting data, analysing that data, running surveys and focus groups, doing something with it. So turning that information then into insight and then making it available, often through online tools, dashboards, reports, that sort of thing. And then we have a couple of other strings to our bow as well in terms of procuring commercial data at a discounted rate. So I know some of you on the call are eagerly awaiting some of that data this month, actually. And then we deliver a range of training and upskilling sessions to local authority staff, but also more broadly to anybody who is interested and wants to ask us to come along and do so. So a whole range of things that we do with and for local government and beyond, and into the broader public sector. So if you're interested in any of that, feel free to get in touch. Okay, National Resident Survey. Hopefully that's why you're all here. You're in the right place. At the end of today, we hope that you've understood what the National Resident Survey is, why we think it's important, and hopefully you'll agree with us by the end of this session. And then we're going to outline some of the challenges and some of the successes that we've had along the way in taking an initial idea from November, December time last year and turning that into a live offer that went live in July of this year. There's a little bit of creativity around the 6 months. It's actually 7 months, but 6 months sounds a little bit better. So hopefully you'll understand that journey, and there's some learning along the way, and we can talk about what's coming next as well. So a quick bit of background then. Obviously, understanding the views of residents is critical to good governance. In order to understand what we need to do, we need to understand what people think and feel about who we are and what we do. And in Wales, this is a principle that underpins a huge amount of what we do in local government. It's taken so seriously that it's actually legislated in a number of places, legislated for in a number of places, including the Wellbeing of Wales Act, the Local Government Elections Act 2021, just to cite a couple. And there's no necessarily prescribed way of engaging with citizens, but resident surveys are a key part of the broader picture. So we wanted to enhance that offer, partly because not all local councils were running resident surveys prior to the offer that we put forward. And probably more importantly, though, each survey that was run was unique. So there was no single picture of what was happening across local councils in Wales on a standardised basis. We had different information on different bases in different places, making it slightly difficult to work out what's going on across the whole sector. Okay, we thought there's a way to deal with this, and we can apply a once for Wales approach here that makes that adds some consistency and comparability to the way of doing things. So that's kind of the genesis of the idea. We then refined that into some more targeted aims. The overarching aim being, we wanted to create a consistent and modular survey. Modular meaning we had a core set of questions, but we could bolt stuff on top and take that in and out. So some sets of questions on top of that core set of questions that we could drop in and out over years as and when required by local authorities. And specifically, there were 4 things that we really wanted to achieve with this project. First was reducing development and running costs. So if we're doing things once, we're not doing them many times, we get some natural savings off the back of that. But more importantly, that standardization and centralization of the approach helps to enhance data quality. So we're doing things once, we're doing things on the same basis, we're able to compare and contrast that data and see some of those quality differences across time and space really quickly, and then do something about them. Thirdly, we then wanted to make sure that actually there's no point just having data. Data is meaningless unless you're able to do something, actually understand what it means. So we wanted to put together a dashboard that then hosts that data, puts it back to users and councils in a way that is meaningful and delivers insight from the underlying information. So that's part of the aim. And then the fourth aim was to then take that information and that insight that you'll get fed to you via the dashboard and help it to actually feed into improvement conversations. So actually, we're now able to discuss and compare and contrast what's happening across Wales. What does that mean for us as a local council? What does that mean for us in terms of how we are potentially thinking about the way that we deliver services or engage with citizens, etc., etc. It's taking that information, turning it into insight, and then turning that into potential conversations and ultimately maybe action, a change of direction where required, or an enhancement of what's already happening, etc. So those were our key aims. We then had to turn those into some deliverables. So what are we actually going to deliver to try and realise those aims? So we said, right, the first thing is obviously the survey. We need a core set of questions that form the standard resident survey. So that's the first deliverable. The second then was turning that information that we gather from the survey into insight. So we said, right, we then need a way of taking that information, pairing it back, putting it together and reshaping it as that insight. And for that, we decided on a dissemination dashboard. And I'll show you a version of that later in the slide deck. And then thirdly, we wanted that flexibility. So local councils may have things that are unique to their areas. They may have want to do deep dives on particular topics that are only of interest to them, or not of interest to all 22 councils in Wales. So we wanted to offer that flexibility, and that's where the third part of the offer comes from, which is this additional question modules. So these can be developed in concert with one or a group of local councils to build on top of that core survey that we've got as our first bullet point there. So that allows then for local variation and local deep dives to happen on top of that standardized core survey. So we have our aims, we have our deliverables. This is what we want to do. How are we going to do it? How are we going to get this thing started? So this is where we get into some of the challenges. I've structured this around challenges 1 to 12. Bear with me. They're interested, and I will dive in and out in terms of detail. I won't bore you to death on these, but yeah, bear with me. We had 12 challenges mainly. We had a few more on top of that, but there's 12 big ones that we wanted to talk about. The first challenge really is we have this great idea, we have these deliverables. Why does anybody care? And particularly, why do they care about us and what we're saying? So how do we establish that credibility for ourselves and for that project? So as it says there, you know, that credibility is really important. When you're not able to show something straight away, you have to be able to show the vision and show why you're the person of the organization that can deliver it. So we did a few things to kind of to put that forward. The first is we actually took that vision I just showed you and turned it into a more refined and deliverable option. So we asked ourselves internally things like, who's going to benefit from this? Who's not going to benefit from this? How are people going to benefit? How are people not going to benefit? And it helped us refine our offer down and down and down to a point where we thought it spoke to the broadest number of people. And we didn't do that on our own. We did that in conversation with our colleagues within the WLGA, in conversation with colleagues in local councils themselves. So we took the offer and we took it out. And then we helped, then we started to refine it down to a really deliverable core vision. The second thing then was we proved the concept. So last year we worked with the Vale of Glamorgan Council, and I think Rob may be on the call today. If you are, hi Rob. And we worked with the Vale of Glamorgan Council to develop a local resident survey with an eye to a potential national development thereof. We partnered with the Vale of Glamorgan Council, so we genuinely had a partnership whereby we worked with them to develop and test questions, and they had a discounted price in return. And what we found through that piece of work was that we got excellent response rates, some of the highest council had ever received, and we had an awful lot of learning in terms of the questions that we developed, and in terms of the dissemination dashboard that we'd also piloted and developed with the Vale of Glamorgan. And those two things formed the basis for the national vision and the national offer. So we had something that we could demonstrate success with, just on a smaller scale. The third thing then was we then went out and engaged, as I said, all along the way to grow our coalition, as I put it there. So people who are interested, maybe need a bit of convincing, maybe want to throw some challenges at us, but just getting that conversation growing, so that we're kind of gathering that interest based on a proven concept and based on a refined offer. We continue to refine that offer through this engagement. So that was kind of our first step. And once we'd got there, we were looking pretty good. But obviously, we then need some money. So as with all projects, they're not free, so we needed some money. We partnered with our colleagues here within the WLJ, particularly the improvement team. So the improvement team is tasked with a lot around performance data, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the acts to which within which engagement activity is prescribed is the Local Government Elections Act 2021, and this is an act that the WLJ improvement team are particularly focused on. So there was a lot of synergy, a lot of crossover there. To be clear, this isn't a performance survey. There just happened to be some crossover on that element of it. This is a resident survey, but there was a mutual overlap. So the improvement team we work with very closely, again partnered with throughout the project, and a really, really good decision and a really, really good relationship. They agreed to fund the development of the core survey. So all the development costs, the one-time development cost, they funded. So we were able to secure some financing. And then to make that go a long way, we maintained a very small but focused team. So we kept our costs low, but our intensity quite high. That works in the short term. In the longer term, we need to kind of smooth that curve a little bit. And then finally, we had to cut our cloth according to our budget. So we'd focused on delivering a small number of high value aims. And again, this fed into that refining of the offer, which I'll come on to in a second. So the third thing then is, right, you've got this great idea, you've got some money behind it, it's starting to gather pace. How do you keep that engagement going, and how do you broaden it so we're getting all the right people in the right rooms and having the right conversations? Particularly in local councils, they're made up of 650 odd services. You have all sorts of services being delivered. How do we engage the right people at the right times? Well, as I click through here, you'll see that from the 6 months in December, January time to delivery in July, we attended a lot of meetings and we hosted a lot of meetings, and they were some of the best time we'd spent. So we had 12 national subgroup meetings. Those were meetings composed of local councils, ourselves and WLJ, where we would come with an iteration of the work that we've been doing. We would present it, we'd get feedback, we'd go away, and then we come back generally 2-3 weeks later with the next iteration. So we had this kind of constant feedback loop throughout the 6 months of the development. And that was really, really helpful in kind of feeding the machine, if you like, a conveyor belt of tasks. We'd get to the end of one section, get feedback very quickly, and then action the next lot, take it back. And in that way, we kept building the offer, but also building the engagement, which was really important. We then had a series of individual meetings with councils where they wanted to ask particular questions or had particular views on things. And those, again, were really important in kind of shaping the work programme. And then we had a really important meeting with data protection officers. So often data protection, and I will come on to this again later in a bit more detail, but often data protection is sort of last on the list. It's the last checklist, if you're the last tick on the checklist before something goes live. We flipped that around. We wanted it to be much earlier in the process. Data protection by design is much easier to deliver. If you're thinking about data protection from day one, from the inception of the project, you're then able to bring people with you and you're able to shape the design of your offer with data protection in mind. So as part of that approach, we met with data protection officers themselves. We invited them, all 22, obviously not all could make it, but we had a really good showing, well over half. And they could hear directly from us what the project was about, why it was so important, what we needed from councils, what they needed from us, and they could then very quickly engage and get things moving on their end in terms of information governance, data sharing, etc. So really, really worthwhile investment of everybody's time. That I couldn't recommend that highly enough. And then, as it says there, we provided regular updates to a series of standing meetings that we attend. So we're in a good place. And as I said, all of that work up to this point is about refining the offer and making sure that the offer speaks to our audience in the right way. That requires some flexibility on our part, but on everybody's part. So we've got local councils, as I said, large organisations, varied, lots of stakeholders within the councils themselves, and lots of pressures on them, and we understand that. So as I said earlier, we had initial funding for the development phase of the work, but we didn't have any funding secured for the ongoing running of this offer. And in an initial iteration of the project, we put that to councils and said, look, we're struggling here. We've got a lot on our plate, Data Cymru. You've got a lot on your plates. There isn't a way to fund this unless you're able to. And the feedback we got, understandably, was that they weren't able to. So we went back and we pivoted and we looked at what we as Data Cymru were able to shift about, move. And through a prioritisation process, we worked out that we could move a few things about and delay a few things to free up some money to support the ongoing elements of this offer. So that, this process ultimately meant that the offer that we're discussing here was free to local councils. So through this process of engagement and refining and understanding the challenges of the problems, we were able to go away and find a solution, which is that there is some ongoing funding now secured indefinitely for this project. So bottom line, the project is free to all local councils. But we weren't working in a vacuum, is challenge number 5. So there were some resident surveys out there and some very, very good ones. So what do we do in that landscape? We're coming in and saying, oh, we think we should standardise the offer and we think there should be one resident survey for Wales. Well, that's going to obviously not work. Well, we've got a couple of surveys that are out there that are doing really good work and they work really well. So what did we do? We had to find a way to make the offer valuable and add value to those councils that were already running their surveys and were not looking to move away from them. So how do we do that? Well, it's about this comparability that I mentioned earlier. A major draw for councils that are running their own surveys and aren't yet ready or don't need to move to the resident survey that we're offering is that they still want to be able to see how they're doing and see how others are doing across the piece. So we said, okay, is there a way that we can work with you to bring some of the data that you're collecting, that data which is comparable and collected on a similar basis to that which we're trying to collect, bring it together and put it in our benchmarking section of our dashboard so that we are bringing in your data and we are completing the picture in terms of coverage across Wales. And that's where we are at the moment. Yes, we're able to do that. We're working with 2 councils at the moment to do it. So we'll have our first tranche of data moving from a survey that isn't the resident survey into our dissemination dashboard that I talked about earlier to expand the coverage to those authorities that are also not taking up the survey element of the offer. So success there, which is great. From there, like I say, there's 22 councils in Wales. Big project, lots of data moving. Lots of pieces to this project. How are we going to do it? How are we going to manage the scale, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, with relatively small budgets? I mean, to put it into perspective, the budget that we are working with, the development budget, is around 1/10 of what some of the large organisations would be spending on similar projects. So how are we managing to do more with less, essentially? There's a few pieces to that. The first is focusing on those key outcomes and those key outputs. So we ensure that stakeholders can feed into design and we stage this delivery. So there's 3 elements, as I mentioned earlier. There's the core survey, there's the results dashboard, and there's those additional question modules. We stay within those, we stage the delivery, working towards a minimum product, a minimal product, or MVP as is known in the agile world, for those of you who work in that world. That's the thing that meets all of the needs, but isn't a Rolls Royce. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it does what you need it to do. So we focused on that as a starting point, and then from there we could iterate and start to add the bells and whistles. But we focused on that minimum viable product as the thing that needed to be out the door first. And that changes the way potentially that you prioritize and think about your tasks and what you're doing. And it did for us. So it kind of shaped the focus on the foundations, then we add the intricacies. And that worked, and I'll speak to how that worked in each of these three sections now. So just a quick recap then up to this point. We've kind of got our funding, we've got our engagement strategy in place. It seems to be working really well. We've refined our offer, and we've got a plan for managing scale by focusing on the core product first, and then iterating to add the bells and whistles afterwards. So what do we do next? Well, we start to develop it. So the first thing we started to develop was the core survey. So in the survey world, there's all sorts of questions that we can ask, anything we like. How do we decide what to ask? Given that we have a large audience, as I've already mentioned, diverse audience, we needed a framework. It's not really appropriate for us today to come and say, yes, you can have that question, no, you can't have that question, without a rationale. And we understood that early on, so we developed one. We developed inclusion criteria for questions. So questions have to be able to do these things in order to be considered for inclusion on the survey. So the first of those things is the questions have to be comparable. So they have to produce data that could be compared across Wales or with external sources. So by that, we often use wording from the census, because we know that we can take the data that we gather through this survey and then compare it with data that was collected on a very similar basis, at least in terms of the question, from census, and get a reasonable comparison there. So that was the first one, comparability. We need to be able to do something with this data beyond just the local council from which it came. The second thing then was necessity and proportionality. So there's no point us collecting 100 questions on, detailed questions on somebody's background. It's not necessary. It's not proportionate. It's not going to be used, by a council in that way. So it's scaling the question to how reasonably it's going to be used. The results are reasonably going to be used. The third thing then was actionability, and it's related. Is this data actually going to be able to is this data reasonably likely to feed into a debate about doing something? It doesn't necessarily have to be actioned, but is this data that is going to be relevant to the potential to do something? So those are our three inclusion criteria: comparability, necessity and proportionality, and then the ability to do something with that data. And this helped. So we have a principled approach. So when we had some questions, and we did have a lot of debate about what should be in and not in the survey in a lot of those meetings I mentioned earlier, by having a framework, we could discuss what needs to be in. We could then put a clear rationale for what should and therefore what shouldn't be in the survey. And that makes it much easier to understand where we're saying, no, we don't think that's appropriate yet. Or maybe we take that away and we pilot it, but we don't bring it in straight away, etc. So yeah, at the end of that, we had a clear framework. As I touched on earlier, data protection is key. So we need to understand, how are we taking care of our data? I won't go into a lot of detail on this slide because I've already referenced it a little bit. But as I said, we employed a data protection by design approach, and we work very closely with the data protection officers in Wales. I'll touch on the third point though. It's really important that data protection is lived. Having all the documents is great, having all the agreements is brilliant, but actually if we don't action them and live them, they're useless. So with this in mind, as I say, we have data protection by design in terms of us living that as we develop the project and as we develop the products. But then also in terms of our engagement, we invited not just our data protection colleagues, but also our analytical colleagues who are likely to be working with the data itself to all of our data protection meetings, because they're part of it. They're part of the use of the data. And so they should understand and be part of the conversation around how that data should be used and protected and codified in then the relevant agreements. So yeah, really important third point there around living data protection, not just writing it down. And then challenge 9 is a really interesting one, particularly when we're working at a national level. It's this specificity versus comparability. So we've got a national survey, that's what we want to do, but we've got local variation. There's a tension. How do we deal with that tension? And agree in what questions need to go in. That's where the framework I just mentioned really helped. But what also made a big difference is actually relying on work that had already been done. So there's no reason for us in a lot of cases to reinvent the wheel. So we used questions that already existed. Again, that helped us with the comparability element I've touched on already, but it also helped us in terms of the development side of things. So ONS, the Office for National Statistics, that is, we'll spend months and months and months refining a question. If that question is suitable for our context, why would we not use it? The development work has already been done, paid for, and tested elsewhere. So we can stand on the shoulders of giants there and actually take what they've done and take it forward. And that's exactly what we did. And where we had to make some edits to make those questions fit for the Welsh context, again, we didn't do that blindly. We did that using existing and agreed and published information. So, for instance, we had quite a lot of debate about the service areas that we were going to cover. This isn't a service level survey, but there's one question that makes reference to services, and we use published information published on the Welsh Local Government Association's website as the starting point for that list. We then refined it in conversation with our colleagues across local government. But the starting point for every single question is either it is a published source. We did not develop anything bespoke because there was no need, and what was out there has generally already been proven and tested, and the work has already been done. So we started from a very high base in that regard, and it served us well. So we've now got to a point where we're able to develop a core survey. We overcame all of those challenges, and by May time we had a core survey that we were happy with, that had gone through other data protection officers that they were happy with, and we had a survey ready and waiting to go. Brilliant. But if we can't see what the results are saying as the survey is in the field, we can't then advise on how to boost response and to spend our time and our engagement efforts here or there to help lift responses in different areas. So we knew we needed to get this results dashboard built before the offer could go live, as was always part of the plan. So what is this results dashboard then? What am I talking about? Some of you will be very familiar with dashboards, some of you may not. The reason we wanted a results dashboard is, one, so that data is all stored in one place. If we're providing a national offer, we don't want data stored in 22 places if we can help it. By also building the dashboard, we're able to hold that data in one place, and then we can access that data, and users can access that data in one place, and therefore they can compare it all in one place. You don't have to go and pull bits from everywhere. Everything is in one central, nice, neat location. And similarly, we can then put one set of messaging around that data. And so we can standardize the presentation and the approach around the data as well as the data itself. Really, really important. If I go back a step, sorry. Really, really important. And that dashboard I will show you in about 5 minutes now. How do you build a dashboard? What are some of the challenges involved with a dashboard, particularly one where we've got all sorts of data coming in from 22 local councils? Well, we use a technology called Power BI. It's a Microsoft technology, so it fits within our IT world. We're a Microsoft house, so everything is Microsoft. It all plays together nicely. Power BI is a bit like Excel in the background, more advanced Excel, and then it has a front end where you can go and make charts interactive, cut and slice them, and you can add a way to navigate through those charts much more intuitively than you can elsewhere. Is a very kind of basic description of it. We hosted the Power BI dashboards in our Data Cymru's environment for a number of reasons. One, we know that environment is tried, tested and secured. But two, and really importantly, we know that local councils then don't need to license their own software. So all the licensing costs lay with us. We already paid them because we use Power BI all the time. So there's a really nice synergy there on its own. We're saving some money for local councils. They don't need to go and buy it. Similarly, we maintain all the data centrally. So local councils obviously can have their own data, it's their data, but we will host and maintain it in one place, in one set of secure infrastructure. And then local councils don't need to think about the security side of things. We've spent an awful lot of time and have an awful lot of experience of securing the pipeline from the data to the presentation, i.e. the Power BI dashboard. We know how to do that. And so doing that once is much more cost effective and much simpler than doing it in 22 places. So these things came together to kind of inform the decision to create a Power BI dashboard. Similarly, technology-wise, we're able to connect that dashboard to the survey data directly. So we use a survey platform called Smart Survey. It's a digital platform. We get survey results held within that digital platform here. And then we've got a Power BI dashboard over there. We've created a pipe between the two of these systems. And if you don't want to, there's no need for any human intervention between the two. So the dashboard draws directly on the survey responses as they come in through the survey software. Now, as it happens, we do have manual checks in place because we want to be able to see the data as it comes through, check it, get a sense of it as it's on its way, as it's on its journey to the presentation. But yeah, in time, and as we become happier with the data itself, we will probably reduce those steps and automate those steps. So at that point now, we have the technology in place, and we have a clear plan for what that dashboard should be able to do. How do we then provide access to you and to local councils on a need-to-know basis? So some of the data we're collecting is sensitive, and not everybody needs to see that. A level of the data isn't sensitive, and more people do need to see the disclosure control data. So we've got a couple of access needs we worked out. The first of those is local councils need to be able to get their raw data. So that's data that literally comes as the survey was submitted. So it could have errors in it, it could have personal information in it, it could have superfluous information in it. All sorts of stuff could be on those forms that isn't what you want ultimately to go into the public domain. So we have to keep that data safe and secure, but make it available to relevant officers within local councils. We then have to apply what's called disclosure control to the data. So that's making sure that nobody can work out who an individual respondent is. So we go through and make sure, we as Data Cymru go through and make sure that it's impossible to work out from the numbers that are there or any combination of the numbers who an individual respondent is. So that's the second layer of data, and that layer of data may be seen then by more people than the first because there's no risk of personal identification. The third layer then is allowing councils to access benchmarking data. So this is data that local councils want to share with each other and believe is useful for that benchmarking conversation, that comparison conversation around the National Resident Survey results. So that layer is probably very similar to the second layer there, your disclosure controlled data, but we may have a couple of nips and tucks in terms of what which questions we want to include or exclude. So yeah, we've got 3 layers of access, all quite different. So how do we manage that? The one sentence covers a lot of complexity there. We use permission-based access. So this is a way that we can assign a user a role, and then we can use that role to then assign them permissions to particular parts of the data set. And that is something that Power BI can accommodate. I won't go into any more detail than that, but if you're interested, don't hesitate to get in touch and we can talk in more detail outside of this setting. But it's Power BI technology. It interacts with the web, so we know who you are. We then assign you a role, and then through that role, we assign you access to different parts of the data set. And this dramatically reduced development costs and the maintenance of this project, because what it means is we can build only one dashboard. We can build one dashboard because we can limit or we can expand what you can see within it. And because of that, We don't need to then build a dashboard for raw data, a dashboard for disclosure control data, and a dashboard for benchmarking. We can do all of those things under one dashboard, but just control what you can see based on who you are. And that made a massive difference to the timeline, to the project costs, and ultimately it produces a much better product because everything, as I said, is in one place. But you might be saying, well, how can you guarantee that's secure? Well, number of things. As I said, we've tried and tested the technology for many years now. We are totally comfortable with Power BI and the way that we deploy it. The second thing is there's human practices that are probably the biggest risk around data of this sort all being in one place. So we've done our best to control those human factors as best we can. So we developed as part of the survey there three key things in this regard. The first is a data disclaimer that sits on the homepage. So when you go on the dashboard, and I'll show you this in practice now, when you go on the dashboard, you see first of all a disclaimer about how you can and can't use the data. You then see a number of pop-up messages. So as you change from one section of the dashboard to another, you get a pop-up message that says, oh no, you've gone somewhere else now. This data needs to be held much more securely than that. So when you're using this data, make sure that you know that this is personal or that it's not. And then thirdly, we color-coded each section. Simple, but you know at a glance that if you're in a red section, that you've got raw data, you've got personal data that you are dealing with. So I'm going to try and do the thing you should never do live, which is I'm now going to try and share my screen, my other screen, and I hope that this works. If you bear with me 2 seconds. Right, there we go. I'm also probably going to have to refresh the dashboard, so if you bear with me. Okay, so this is an early version of the dashboard. The live version has each local authority's logo here based on who they are. So if you log in as somebody from Ceredigion County Council, you will have Ceredigion County Council's logo here. This is the home page, and within it, you can see a number of sections. The first of those, as I said, is terms of use. And as you go into terms of use, you get the terms of use, what you should and shouldn't do at a relatively high level with the data. Alongside this, then, we've got information about the data itself. So how have we collected it? We've got a methodology section. What are some of the limitations to the data and how we should interpret it? And what are the areas, the geographies that this data is available at? And for those who are statistically minded or work in the space, the data is collected at postcode level and then is made available at a lower super output area. That's a census geography that's quite a low geography. There's nearly 2,000 of those areas in Wales to give you a census scale. So you get a lot of background information, and that will expand over the next couple of months as we get more and more surveys online, and therefore we get more and more methodological information to be included. If I go back to the home page, then you can see your response rates as a local council. So if I can see them as a table or as a chart. So if I click on as a chart, this is all dummy data, so don't worry. Any of you on the call who have your surveys live, this isn't your data, this is all dummy data. And what we're seeing here is an example of what I was talking about. We've got this pop-up, and this pop-up is saying, right, before you can see the data, before you do anything, beware that we haven't applied any disclosure control to this data. This is raw data, so there might be some personal stuff in here, or it might be possible to work out who an individual is. So you should not share this data outside of your organization. And in order to go and see the data, I have to read it, click agree, and now I can go in and start to understand what the data is telling me. As you can see, we've got red coloring. We've got a logo at the top that says, no, disclosure control hasn't been applied. Don't go sharing this data. But in terms of what you can and can't do here, you can do a lot. So what this page is showing is response rates across the top. Sorry, number of responses across the top. So in our dummy data, we had 55 responses on the 9th of July. And we had 5 responses on the 12th of July. So we can see how those responses come in over time. But that's across everything, across all of our area and all of our breakdowns of interest. I can go and cut that data by different geographies. I can go and cut that data by different age groups. I can cut it by sex, and I can cut it by deprivation level. So this uses, again, for those of you in the space, the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation. It uses that to assign a deprivation ranking to each area. So we can look at what response rates look like by how deprived an area is. And then crucially, we can also understand what our response rates look like by the format that the survey was received in. So this survey, the National Resident Survey, can be sent out as a digital survey, as a paper survey, or as an easy read survey. And so by being able to cut your data in that way, you can see whether there are differences in the response by the way in which, or the mode through which the survey was completed. So lots of information here in terms of the response rate. And this tab is designed to be used while the survey is live, as well as when the survey is closed. So this tab will inform local councils, because they'll have access as soon as their surveys go live, will inform them of where their responses are coming from. And that will help them then to target their communications or engagement activities, potentially to underrepresented or undercovered groups within their council area. So this is something we'd recommend looking at least once a week while the survey is open, and to be reviewing this in light of your engagement strategy. So that's why we put that in there. So we're then moving through, the survey's now closed, let's say, before we go into your data. At this point, you can see your data as, raw data, as I said earlier. So this is Sam Sullivan. Let's say I work in, I don't know, Ceredigion County Council. I click on this. I can see Ceredigion County Council's raw data. As I said, this is all dummy data, so don't worry. I'll go straight to the bottom. What you're able to see is each question across the top in this table view, and all the results by row. So each row represents a survey. And then as you scroll across, you will get the results for each of those rows by question. You say, oh, okay, that's a lot. There's a lot going on there. You're right. But again, you can cut and slice that by all of these different indicators. So you can reduce this table dramatically very quickly when you start to dig into what the data actually means. And again, we've same options as we had just now on the response rate tab, but we can also break it down by some additional options. So by question itself, if I only want to look at that question, I can, and this will just take a second to load. There you go. So if I only care about postcode, I can filter only on postcode. If I want to add in something else that I care about, I can do so. I can add in question 3 with its drop downs. So I can manipulate this table then to the size and shape that I'm interested in. And going a step further, I can then see that data as charts. But you'll notice now we're in a green section. So this data has been disclosure controlled. So we, Data Gymru, have gone through and we've taken out any possibility of an individual being identified within the data. And then we're able to present this back to local councils, to a wider group than who had access to the red sections, in a slightly different format. So first of all, you'll see on this page where your responses are coming from. So as I mentioned, digital, paper, and easy read. I can get a sense of, well, what's my digital response looking like? Oh, actually, most of my responses are digital. Digital. What about my easy read? What does that look like? And I can go and look at my responses then by that mode, as we call it. I can then go into the survey results themselves, and these, as I said, are disclosure controlled. So, for instance, I can go into about your area, and these are all chart based now rather than tables. Again, I can manipulate what I want to see in front of me. I can make selections and break down and cut and slice this data as I'm interested in. And then I can move through question by question, theme by theme across the top. And if I'm interested in, let's say, a particular part of this pie chart, I can hover over it and I'll get a tooltip that helps me understand that in a little bit more detail. And if I go back here, I can understand in this section who is responding. As I said, this is all dummy data, but I can understand which areas those individuals are responding from. I can understand a little bit more about the deprivation of the areas from which they're responding. And then we've got all these other themes across the top where I can delve into who these people are that are responding to the survey. And then finally, I'm just conscious of time, and finally, we've got this benchmarking section here. So this is where local councils can go in and use the disclosure control data that I just showed you there to compare and contrast with other participating councils. So if I have a look at the data as charts, you'll see it's now orange. So what this means is the data has been disclosure controlled, so there's no risk of personal identification, but actually we're saying that you don't own. So me, Sam Sullivan, let's say I work in Ceredigion Council, I don't own Anglesea's data, so I have no right to go and put Anglesea's data in the public domain. And that's what this message is saying. It's saying you can see other councils' data, but you can't go and put it in the public domain. It's for them, as the council that owns the data, to do so. But we can go in here and look at data question by question, indicator by indicator, so question by question, essentially. And we can then pick the areas that we're interested in looking at, comparing and contrasting, as well as particular categories of the response that we're interested in. At the moment, we've only got 1 year's worth of data, or we will only have 1 year's worth of data by about Christmas time, as we only launched in July, but we have the capability to hold this data and show this data over time as line charts, essentially. Yeah, that's a really whistle-stop tour of, I've got to work out how to stop sharing now, bear with me. That's a really whistle-stop tour of that dashboard. And I will very, very quickly sum up and then take any questions that you've got. So excuse me 1 second while I get to the previous slide. Okay. Conclusion. Right. So what's the impact of all of this work? Well, we're really proud to have done the work, first of all, and we couldn't have done it without working with local councils. And a lot of you on the call today have been part of that process. So first of all, a big thank you to all local councils and our colleagues within WLGA, because this was a team effort. We didn't do this on our own. The impact of this work will be 3 or 4-fold. The first is that we're going to have more councils running resident surveys as a result of this. We can see that already within the first 2 months. And really importantly, we're going to have councils doing resident surveys who previously weren't. So they're going to be getting information that they weren't beforehand. We're going to have, therefore, more resident satisfaction data than ever. So we're going to have more information to work with, turn into insight, and then hopefully turn into action. And we're going to have more comparability, or the ability to compare that data over time and across Wales. So rather than having lots of disparate bits of information, we've now got one set of information that is relatively internally consistent and comparable. And that's going to help us to really establish a baseline for these comparison conversations. And so some of the key takeaways then off the back of this project, and then I promise questions, I will put them on the page and not speak to each of them. But the key takeaways are basically get senior stakeholders involved very early, get that credibility piece sorted so that people understand that you're serious and you're able to do this, and work collaboratively. So focus on that engagement and not just big one-off set pieces. Those are great, but the small regular conversations are actually where a lot of the work and the development gets done. And then off the back of that, be a bit flexible. You have to be able to compromise and refine the offer in light of what you're hearing. You know, we can't go in and just stamp our feet and say this is what's happening. We've got to be able to kind of compromise and reach the right conclusions. And then standardize that process itself. So if we've got a framework around how we're going to include questions or not, it makes the conversations much easier because we're not working on somebody based on somebody's whim. We're working on an established framework, a set of logic for what should and shouldn't be part of the conversation. And then similarly, what falls out of that is prioritizing on the things that really matter to get in your minimum viable product, horrible term, but the thing that does all that you needed to do out the door as quickly as possible. And then we found that the way to do that, at least to that initial phase, is to use a relatively small, flexible team. As the project expands and you move into later phases of the project, you probably need to expand the team, but you can get to that initial product with a relatively small and flexible team nice and quickly. So what's next? Very quickly, as I said, the project is open-ended. We are funding it, and it will be there in perpetuity, essentially. What's next is we're going to develop the second part of the core survey. So we have about 30 questions at the moment. We're going to be adding around another 10 or so this year. So by July 2025, that second part of the core survey will be ready to go live. And at the same time, we will be opening up the conversation for additional question modules. So those bits where local councils have particular needs and they want particular questions set, we will be opening that up from July 25 as well. And as it says there, in the data dissemination dashboard I just showed you, we will be adding in more functionality along the way. One part of that functionality is going to be able to map the data. So you're not just seeing it in tables and charts, you'll also have a map view. And we've got a number of other things that are on our list in terms of expanding the insight that you can gain from that dashboard. And then really importantly, we're going to continue to meet with stakeholders regularly. So those of you on the call I know have been part of this to date, we'll be back. We're going to be talking to you very soon, and we're going to keep that conversation live. And as it says there, this is just the start. This is an ongoing offer that we hope to continue to refine and build on, and continue to make a difference with. So with that, thank you very much. And are there any questions in the chat? I will stop sharing my slides.
Thanks for that, Sam. That was really insightful. I can't see at the moment any questions in the chat. However, this is normally Suzanne's one, but I actually have a couple of questions, if that's okay. First of all, I just wanted to ask, you may not be able to say, like I said, I'm normally behind the scenes sort of at Data Cymru, so I'm not necessarily in the detail as my colleagues are. So I just wanted to know in terms of which councils, if you're allowed to say, which ones have gone live and the survey's actually in the field already?
Yeah, I think I can. I mean, they're promoting them, so yeah. So we'll do a bit more promotion. Yeah, we've got 5 in the field right now. So we've got Ceredigion, Swansea, Bridgend, Blaenau and Gwent and Monmouthshire are all open and live. So if you live in any of those council areas, please submit a response. We've got 2 more going live in the next 2 weeks. We have, after that, then 2 councils that we are working with to bring data in who run their own surveys. And then we know of a number of others, and we're in discussions with them who are in the political stages of getting this signed off. So we are pretty confident that we will have over half of local councils in Wales having run the survey within the first year of the offer, which is fantastic and exceeding our expectations, which is great. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you, Sam. We have got a couple of questions coming in. We've got a little bit of time. So Laurie's asked, are there any future plans to publish a public version of these survey results, a public facing dashboard?
Okay, public facing dashboard, not at the moment, but in terms of survey results, each local council is expected to make clear what the results of their survey were. So the data will all the appropriate data will be published by the councils themselves, yes, but not a public facing dashboard at the moment.
Thanks, Sam. Oh, Richard's stolen my other one as well. Richard's asked about early indications around response rates. Again, if you're obviously able to say some detail, but not. Yeah,
very good. Is the short answer. Very good. We've had survey, the longest one has been open now about 2 months, and the response rate there is a lot higher than was predicted. But more importantly, and those others that are open, I mean, some of them will be open a week, and we've got, one's been open for a week, and we've got nearly a 4-figure response rate already.
Wow.
2 things. First of those is that the response rates are relatively balanced and coverage is relatively balanced. We're always going to have highs and lows in terms of where the responses are coming from, but generally they're very balanced. And then in terms of how do we get response rates to that point, part of it is survey design. The survey is relatively short and sharp and easy to respond to. The other part of the equation then is the council is doing a really good job of promoting and engaging. So the response rate is a combination of those 2 things, and that's a big part of why we put that response rate dashboard together to help the council understand what's working and what isn't in terms of their engagement strategy. And at the moment, things really look like they're working, which is great.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Sam. We are nearly at time, so we don't have any other questions in the chat. So on that note, thank you very much, Sam, and we hope all of you on the call today have enjoyed the session and found it useful. If you have any questions, or if you'd like more information, then please get in contact. Obviously, contact details will be in the slides that go out, but I'll post details in the chat as well. We will shortly share the recording of today's webinar along with the presentation. And we've got some future webinars in the pipeline. We're just currently finalising some of the details, and these should be published on Ticket Source very soon. And it leaves me to say thank you all very much for your time and enjoy the remainder of your afternoon. Thank you all. Diolch yn fawr.